everybody, it's Omar, president and founder here at BusySeed. And in today's webinar, we're going to be talking about, are you invisible to your AI because of your data practices? And this is a pretty good one because ultimately here, what I want to do is give you an actionable framework for your privacy first growth without losing performance. So when we look at this and we talk about privacy, this is something that some people are more familiar with, something that people generally, aren't familiar with. At the end of the day, privacy isn't just a legal requirement anymore. It's actually the operating system that what most of marketers and marketing needs to run on in 2026. Brands that win here aren't going to be the ones that collect the most data. They're going to be the ones that build trust and they use clean systems to execute with these new constraints. So today we're going to be talking about, quite a few things here. We're going to be talking about, the aspects of what these constraints are, these platforms and all of that, and a lot of different things to keep in mind. But let's start off here. And before we get into all of that, I felt that social has been less predictable these days. Attribution has been getting a little bit weaker. Targeting has become harder to control. You're not crazy. It's actually happening. In some, definitely you have, more seasoned marketers will feel this more hardcore. And maybe some of, junior marketers or, anybody running ads for small business and such, maybe you won't necessarily feel that. But what has changed really hasn't just been the algorithm. It's the relationships that have changed. What are those relationships? Platforms and users, brands and consumers, AI and personalization, measurement and truth. When we talk about privacy first marketing, it's important to notate that isn't going to actually kill performance. It's actually going to create better systems to build trust, to actually get better performance. And we might look at this as counterintuitive. It's like, oh, if I can't track this data or, this piece here, or I can't track this conversion, I can't do my job right. There are elements of that are true, but simply put, this is 2026. Times are changing. And if you're not following along in changing the way that you do your marketing systems, your tracking, your analysis, all of that there, you're left in the dust. So let's talk about it. The biggest shift, why privacy actually is now the baseline and why it's reshaping marketing faster than most teams expect. So ultimately, data privacy is reshaping marketing because the old systems that really prioritize performance and data over everything, over transparency, just isn't defensible anymore. For years, we as digital marketers, we ran so much on behavioral tracking, cross-site behaviors, cross-device behaviors, high-resolution attribution, infinite retargeting loops. All of this massive amount of data has made consumers less trusting. And the consumer's reaction, obviously, we think about apps such as, or platforms, social media platforms like Meta has, or really search or anything like that. It's causing issues and it's eroding people's trust to the point where those platforms, they know they have to change. And so they are changing. So we have to think about changing ourselves. So the change really comes from a few different areas to be clear. It's not just the platforms. Let's start off with regulation. The GDPR, CCPA, and other enforcement agencies, whether it's state, federal, international, they're applying a lot of pressure onto these bigger companies and forcing them to change. On top of that, platforms and browsers, they're receiving the same type of pressure. So it's not necessarily just the social media that's going on, but actual, software. And we think about our phones. We think about Apple. When Apple released one of their iOS updates, it cracked most digital marketing. And I remember we were over here losing our minds trying to figure out, okay, well, how are we going to track leads? How are we going to track these different aspects? So that was problematic, but it's something that's still important to where it was actually problematic for those who want to geek out with me a little bit. I apologize. I'm dealing with a little bit of a cold here, but when the iOS release came out and it started really impacting the, actual conversions and such, everybody was in a rush to really create their own server side type, SDKs and such. And really what that was simply instead of, somebody clicking on an ad in the browser, going to the website, that was cut off by Apple. By default, it disabled any type of tracking that way. So what everybody else did was server-side tracking. So instead of having the browser do it on the front end, they took it all and they put it on the server-side end so that the server would send data analytics back to these advertising platforms so we'd still get some numbers. Not a perfect system, but it was their only way to combat it. Even still now, Meta still reels from that update that happened. But pressure comes from governments. That goes on to the device makers. Those device makers then put that onto the online platforms. Those online platforms go on to the marketers. That's the realistic truth of it. But the most important reason why this is happening that we have to keep in mind is that consumers are losing trust in how data is used. You think about it, even of yourself. How many times have you looked at your phone? You said, is that thing recording me? Whether, there's a lot of different stories. There's a lot of different stuff, disclosed or leaked, all that, whether it is or it isn't. I'm not here to get into that. But ultimately, regardless of what the truth is, consumers are just losing trust. And that is how the consumers feel. Those consumers affect sales of devices. They affect subscriptions of, different platforms. So we have a lot of control. We don't always realize it, but we have a lot of control, especially when we band together. We can voice our opinions and make platforms change. And that's been absolutely happening. And as marketers, as advertisers, we need to keep that in mind. But ultimately, one of the biggest mistakes that I see just, across the board of how people treat privacy is that it's not a checklist. It's not just the compliance checkbox. You go, okay, privacy's done here. I did this here. It's entirely a mentality and a methodology of how you run your marketing. And that needs to be designed as early as possible to achieve success. Now that we've established that that's simply just the baseline, privacy first is just the baseline, let's actually talk about measurements and how we adjust for that on the different platforms. So let's start off with Meta, Facebook and Instagram. When Apple introduced the app tracking transparency, it royally screwed Meta. They were scrambling. They still are experiencing long-term loss from that. There are still signals that we can't get as marketers anymore from Meta. Because of this, opt-in tracking, it's especially the way Apple has introduced and set it by default. What Meta has really started to do is that they start to fill in the gaps with aggregated reporting, model conversions, and what they call aggravated event measurement. Now, the big shift in 2026 is that what Meta is really expanding on is the personalized inputs. So the AI, and where, we have other videos talking about AI as well, but AI assisted interactions are more apt to inform ad recommendations. And so we're going to be seeing this shift in terms of, giving consent, using tools in a consensual way to give that. And we're also going to be seeing differences of these platforms keeping everything within the model instead of going out. So we think of ads on Meta, on Instagram. Those go out, you see one, you click on it, takes you to a website. Very seldomly do you go back into, a Meta platform from there. It takes you to the website, and then the tracking on that website reports everything back to Meta. Well, with this, especially with Apple's ATT, they prevented that, and a lot of others have started, joining into that as well. So what's going to be happening with AI is that a lot of that's going to be sitting within the platform, and you're going to be chatting with the AI within the platform. You're not going to be necessarily going to another page. In the beginning, yes. In the beginning, they're going to say, hey, well, you know what? Here's a recommendation. Check these guys out. And we go into a different page. But ultimately, what all of these players are going to try to do is allow the entire ecosystem of a lead, of a purchase, of all of that to happen within the AI. So that is going to be changing entirely how we take a look at things and how measurement happens. Let's talk a little bit about, for those who have, web experience, or, any developers or anybody in the, listening to this, this webinar here, the concept of a cookie is starting to be done away with. And let's talk about cookies. So what a cookie is, besides one of my favorite foods in the world, anybody who wants to just send a box of cookies to the BusySeed office or anything like that, please feel free to do. I'm always a happy camper. But what a cookie is besides that is that it's a small piece of data that gets stored on your browser. And historically, what cookies are used for is to create personalization in memory to the website of who you are. So let's say you visit a website, you log in. Let's say you go to Insomnia Cookies. Shout out Insomnia. Feel free to send anything my way. When you go in, let's say you have an account, you log in, all of that. They're going to store certain pieces of information about you onto the browser so that instantly, without you logging in or anything, they can know a little bit about you. And so a lot of advertisers, a lot of Google Ads does this, Meta does this. They all store cookies on your browser that can be used on other websites so they can identify you. They can say, yep, this person just clicked on the ad. Then they just went over here. So that's what cookies are really, the small pieces of data stored on your browser. So when you visit the site back, they remember you. But as of late, with all the regulatory bodies coming in to create pressure, Google has been starting to go through and eliminate third-party cookie tracking and going more to user choice models. So you may have noticed on different websites that you visit, the first thing that pops up is consent form that asks, hey, we'd like to store information about you to give you a personalized experience. You can opt out of it or not. That's the way the world's going. So the default story of cookies is starting to become illegal, especially in Europe. You can't do that. You have to make sure you ask consent before you do that. So what this means is that things are going to be changing. And right now it's in a rough patch until there's more fuller AI adoption, which we have videos about that. The tracking and that predictability is going to start going out the window. It's going to be a lot more difficult to really understand, all right, what users are doing. Ultimately, like we mentioned, what I mentioned just above, with Meta and such, is that once they have their AI model built out, people are using Gemini more and more. All of that's going to stay within the platform to where if you complete all the tracking aspects of a conversion, of a lead, of all that will happen within the platform. So there's nothing that Apple can do. There's nothing that any platform or really any regulatory body can do at that point, especially if you've already pre-consented by signing it. So with tracking getting weaker and these AIs model more moving towards the truth, we have to think about a lot of where generative AI is and the ethical risks of it. AI isn't just a tool. It's a system that creates new risk, essentially. When AI interacts with customers, it can make mistakes, and those mistakes become trust issues, not just technical issues. So in some other videos and topics, we talk a lot about how you train your AI or how you train the AIs, the ChatGPTs, the Claudes, the Geminis, the Perplexities, all of those different large language models, the LLMs. How you train those is important because when people start searching for you, and this term, an AI hallucination has come up, where it outputs something that's completely wrong with full confidence. So in the same example of cookies, if you look me up and you say, hey, what's one of our favorite foods? Oh, he loves pasta. Absolutely not true. Cookies over pasta any day. But I know that's actually going to create some stir. So I apologize in advance, but they're just that. But when it comes down to it, it's important that teams are using their time and their, in focusing their generative output on writing content, scaling creative, doing all this to make sure it's all being truthful. It's creating as much of the narrative as possible to avoid giving a hallucination or something completely wrong to the actual, to the user that's prompting them. And, the ethical risk here comes from two places: data origin. When I talk about data origin, it's important to think about where the models are training, where the model training data comes from. That matters because, when we think about training models and how we do the training, obviously AIs and these LLMs, they have been trained already. And we can do the training ourselves with the different practices as businesses, but we're not training the actual model. We're just training we're giving it more information about us. And we're not doing that hyper level of training that, the indexing of the entire web, putting all that context together, vectorizing. We're not doing that. But we have to keep in mind that each of them trains differently. And the data and all of that, the personal data, proprietary, sensitive data, increases exposure risk. So that's something that we need to take as marketers into deep, a deep account. There's another big issue for us to really think about here in terms of the legal aspect. Right now, AI is still in its infancy. But as it becomes more and more widespread, these AI companies are going to start trying to figure out all legal ways to push off everything so that they are legally not liable for whatever comes up. And what's going to happen is that companies that are using AI and they don't necessarily, or are feeding AI, they don't necessarily have the governance behind it, and they don't think about compliance of the content that they're putting out there, is going to create compliance and reputational issues. And this can lead to a lot more legal trouble. You want to make sure that you are taking the initiative. Don't trust the AI models. Don't trust OpenAI. Don't trust Anthropic. They're going to, every company, as much as possible, is going to skirt their legal responsibilities and say, no, this was the content here and here. We're just using what's publicly available. If you have content, if you're writing content and you just blindly use AI to create that content, for example, or you don't think about the content that you're putting out there, that's going to get indexed. And when the lawsuit goes down the line, when somebody sues OpenAI, OpenAI says, nope, this is the data that we got from here. Then when that lawsuit goes down to you because you put out that data because you used AI, you can't then say, oh, we got this data from AI. They're a bigger company than you. That lawsuit's not going to go anywhere. The lawsuits and all the compliance and the regulatory issues are going to be focused on you and your business. So don't put AI slop out there. Make sure you read through everything. Make sure that you have a really good understanding of the content that's going out there. That's important. The beauty behind AI is that it should increase speed, but at the end of the day, AI should not be left unleashed. It should have humans that still own the truth, that still look over everything and take accountability for what it is. Again, we're always going to take the accountability. That's the way the legal system, that's the way society works. But AI can help us in terms of getting ahead a lot faster. One beautiful thing about AI and what it does is that it creates a level of personalization that has been unmatched before in the world of marketing, which is beautiful to see. But that personalization cross a line. So it's going to be very important to distinguish between hyper-personalization versus surveillance. Really, in 2026, personalization really isn't about, the maximum amount of precision. It's about being responsively relevant. And what I mean about that is you can get down to understanding, everybody talking to somebody and putting personals like, hey, we know you're dealing with this specific issue in your life, showing an ad or showing whatever, or content around that, especially if you are more so working in, the confines of, an ad or, a personalized app or what have you, or something on your website that outputs something. You can get hyper-personalized, but there's a line. Hyper-personalized versus surveillance. And people are so very sensitive to surveillance. More so now, we're living in a big a surveillance state where, we have, these different federal agencies that are using social media data to track down people and to create a digital ID to understand everything that you're doing. And what happens there is that it erodes trust. If personalization comes from an invisible inference instead of clear consent, it's going to stop feeling helpful and start feeling intrusive. And we don't want brands to feel like that, especially for our clients. That's something that we take a lot of, focus on is, making sure that we get personalized without necessarily going too far. Because once you start doing that and trust is broken, or gaining trust becomes difficult. And people make a lot of decisions with their wallet. So if you're thinking about, your business and how you want that to happen, you have to think about that balance there between the personalization and getting too creepy and getting into the, hyper-personalized aspect of it. So, when we used to think about it as marketers, we used to say, yeah, hyper-personalization used to be the goal. More data, more relevance, better performance. But we got so focused in on the data that we started eroding the trust of the consumers. And now trust is the limiter. This is going to matter a lot because the content that you put out and the stuff that gets generated when people, they're using anything that you're producing, you start to feel uncomfortable when they know too much, especially when we think about ads, where the entire industry is shifting now with AI ads. If the ads start getting too personalized, and there's going to be some, privacy walls that these AI companies are going to do, but when they start getting super personalized and they get too much to the point where they know too much, trust is going to start to erode with your brand. And it's going to be important to understand that there's going to be a lot of these agencies like FTC and such that are going to really have their eyes microscoped in on you and on the types of content that you're producing. and how sensitive those attributes are and what brands are exposing. There's going to be a lot more. Right now, it's the Wild West, but give it 6 months. There's going to be much more regulation, and there's going to be much a deeper eye on what you can do and what you can't. And ultimately, the problem here is going to be lawsuits. The biggest thing that is that can really happen and that people are already facing right now, it's getting sued because the data that's put out is, too sensitive, is a lie, is not actually true because it was, something that, what AI said, in full confidence, a hallucination that was wrong. But the way we should really think about this is, in my practical guidance for you in terms of, how you look at your audiences are get their declared preferences. Make sure that, these things are, as much as possible, try to get it from the user themselves. Try to get as much information from them. That consent, when you get it from them, consent. When you start looking at other aspects of, trying to find their site offline, scraping, enrichment, all of that. And I'll actually, allude to this a lot in the B2B world, going out to a database, getting somebody's cell phone number, calling them up, what's the first thing that you hear? How'd you get this number? It's an invasion of privacy. And a lot of times, while those methodologies might work at scale, if you're doing, 1,000 calls, you might get one that says, yeah, hey, let's talk. You're still breaching trust. And that is a bad aspect on your brand. And you actually do a lot more damage to your brand that you'll never see because, users aren't going to say, oh, I didn't, they're not going to call you back. I'm just like, hey, I did need this service, but I'm not actually going to go with you guys because you guys broke my trust. So we've been talking a lot about, all of this, what to watch out for, but let's talk about what marketers can do and can't do right now. So what marketers still can do, and that still works, segment using first-party data or clear opt-ins. Again, emails, CRMs, lead forms, all of that. If they give the information, great. Ask better questions. Use more personalization. Get more creative in how you do that. You can personalize your brand very much by declare preferences or on-site behavior. That's fine. That's consensual. Using automation inside consented systems like follow-up, lead routing, nurture sequences, campaign optimization, all of that is still fine and well. And obviously keep doing that. And two, there's still a lot of data to be gained from that, aggregated reporting from these different models, especially with AI coming out and with the consent coming in those aspects. There's going to be a lot more data that can be used, the user consented, that will allow us to create personalization. And ultimately building remarketing audiences tied to the platforms that are owned. Again, don't want to be a stalker, don't stalk, but get them to give you more. Recreate how you do your marketing. And think about the experience, how users are experiencing your brand. When you're asking certain questions from them, ask it in a clever way, ask it in better ways so they give you that information that you want. And this is where it's also helpful to have, a revenue growth group like, BusySeed that doesn't just focus on the tech or the marketing, but also the sales enablement side of it. Because when it comes down to it, at the end of the day, most businesses, you want to get revenue, you want to get a sale, however that looks. And knowing how to speak to them, knowing how to answer the questions in discovery, as you go along with them on the buying journey, that's going to be really, really important. One thing we want to avoid doing as marketers is we want to avoid buying third-party data with the unclear consent, doing some of those outreaches and the types of outreaches that simply don't necessarily have, again, cell phone is the example there. Obviously on the B2B sense, there's still aspects of this that work, but those are going to shift and the B2B landscape is going to shift entirely itself as well. And how to generate leads and such. You want to make sure, we're the endless cross-platform retargeting. And, if a user is saying like, how do they get this data? And they got this data because they were connected to this site, that connected to this site, that talked, all the way through, trust is going to erode. And treating compliance like a workaround instead of a policy or trust issue, that's going to be important. So, yeah, we clearly were talking about, some B2B and to all the B2B marketers, which I think this is important. It's something important to remember is that, B2B marketing, obviously a lot of good B2B marketing and a lot of B2B marketing that we do revolves around email, revolves around LinkedIn, and revolves around outreach. So it's important that to keep in mind how this is going to be shifting for everybody here, because essentially regulators and the platforms are starting to care less about, how you said it. They couldn't care. When you think about spam filters, when you think about there, it's a constant war of getting into the inbox and getting into whether it's a LinkedIn inbox, an email inbox. It's really a war between you as the company, as the senders, as the, whatever, to the actual, email companies that are trying to reduce down spam and trying to do all of that there. So it's important to keep in mind that there are going to be other regulatory bodies and things that are going to be changing. So it's going to be important to understand when you're doing this type of outreach, to consider where your data is coming from, to consider how it's collected. And that's an important thing because, some of these databases just have some really bad, poor collected data that's been aging for years and they'll sell it to you. Those guys and those types of emails, and if you haven't seen it already as a B2B marketer, you absolutely should be seeing it because it, open rates, reply rates, all of that just plummet. They're bad. But we start to think about too, what happens, in those purchase lists. Sometimes the legality and those ethics really don't align. But also when we're thinking about really AI types of outreach, which is becoming more and more popular, we need to keep in mind that, the personalization at scale can create hallucinations, which become misleading fast. So if you just deploy, an AI outreach, I've heard a lot of clients come, and mention saying like, oh, we haven't actually, we've done this, this, and that, but we haven't seen it or, any growth from it. Well, just like anything, you do it the wrong way, it's going to actually have a negative impact on you, especially this. If you have your AI hallucinating, and like if you're a company that somebody replies back to your outbound email and you have AI responding to it, it says, oh, hey, can you guys support this and that? And your AI says yes, and they call you up and you're having the conversation with somebody that's ready to close because, again, AI built up the intent for you. They're going to ask you about that thing like, oh, no, we don't offer that. They're like, your guy over email said that you guys would, or, oh, John from LinkedIn messaged that before he scheduled the call. So it's important to keep that in mind. And trust is a very, very, very big topic, obviously, as we've been discussing here. But trust consequences are very measurable. And what that looks like, more spam complaints, declining deliverability, and long-term brand damage. Now, out of those, you'll see spam complaints, you'll see declining deliverability, and those are going to be the measurable things. But the long-term brand damage is ultimately going to be on your positive reply rates, on your actual meeting set rates, and ultimately how the rest of your metrics for every campaign forward goes. So it's important to keep in mind how you do your B2B marketing. We went over a lot of things today. So in closing here, what I'll mention is that the brands that win in 2026 are going to be the ones who aren't necessarily tracking the most, but they're the ones who are being consensual, who are earning permissions, who build these defensible systems that we've been talking about, and who execute on keeping these privacy constraints strong within the entirety of their brands. Now, if you feel like measurement's getting harder and you feel like all of that, that's true. It's not a failure. It's not, a negative thing. It's simply a change in the environment. And as marketers, we all know that changing is very important and we need to change fast for growth. But ultimately, there's a lot to be done here and there's a lot of concerns. And a lot of times our clients come to us for the same reason, because we help a lot of times modernize marketing, the entire marketing departments and the marketing mindsets of our clients, whether it be entire departments or even just having goals of, making sure content is better or making sure ads run better or all of that. We take a lot of first party data strategy, privacy first targeting and measurement, ethical automation systems, and then making sure that we govern AI in such a way within these workflows so that it doesn't hallucinate. Ultimately, if you're really looking to try to get ahead and all of this is overwhelming, please give us a call, have some conversation with us. We'd love to sit down, talk to you about how we can help your business get into the new age of digital marketing and ultimately prevent yourself from running into these legal issues, these compliant issues, and in eroding your brand trust. So feel free to reach out, email, text, carrier pigeon. You'll see the carrier pigeon is actually down there as a stuffed animal. But feel free to reach out, and we're more than happy to help. Thank you so much for listening to this to the webinar, for spending time with me today. It's a pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.